So let's slowly start. Please take your seat. You can bring your coffee to your seat. There are some more people coming in, so we'll give it a few more minutes, but please start taking your seats. So I think we will start. Warmly welcome. It's really nice to see so many here and to hear the buzz in the room that you're taking some coffee and chatting a bit with your neighbors, and we will start this seminar. Yes, there's some more coming in. Well, my name is Annika Weppling-Korsnäck, and I'm head of the European Commission's representation here in Sweden. And you are here in Europahuset, or House of Europe, where we have this as a meeting place, a place where we can organize seminars, meeting places where we can meet and discuss EU policies or policies that concern us all in the changing world that we are experiencing at this very moment. And the theme of today is, of course, one that really concerns us all. 86% of the EU population feel that increased spread of disinformation is a real threat to our democracy. That is a very high number. And it feels like this is also increasing. The disinformation is increasing, but also the fear of it. We have seen disinformation campaigns targeting a number of European elections recently. We have seen interference also in Swedish elections. Not that bad yet, but we have an election coming up in September. We don't know where that is going, but we see that the potential for interference is increasing, and it's orchestrated by foreign powers, and the aim is to destabilize our societies. And this is, of course, the question of today. How do we strengthen our societies? How do we increase our capacities and our resilience in societies to counter this, to see it, to see that it happening, and also to counter it? This is what this seminar will be all about, and it will be really exciting to hear the panelists' take on it. This seminar has been organized by the Commission, but with the greatest help and also the greatest minds behind it being the Norden International and Edelstam Institutet. And I would like to greatly thank these two organizations for taking this initiative and driving this seminar. And I would like to first hand the floor to Mats Hellström from Norden International to give a few welcoming words. So, Mats.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Annika, for letting us be here in your Europahuset, and not just being here physically, but also that the European Commission is part of the program, that you are have been very active in making up this program. That I would like to thank you very much for. And also, of course, as you mentioned, the main themes, European democracy under pressure in the post-truth era. What is really post-truth? And how can we relate to things that we hear, listen to, take part in if you don't know if it's true or not? What is post-truth? So what measures are required to increase Sweden's and the EU's resilience to this, to also mention? And sorry, okay. Okay, you're translating to some strange language, or? Yes. Okay, thank you. The sharply increasing spread of fake news. Fake news is now so much mentioned that it's, for many people, it's just news, not fake news. And conspiracy theories, they has led to growing hostility. Unfortunately, hostility towards academia and independent media, as well as toward public authorities and political institutions. All these things are we going to discuss today, and then of course trying to find remedies also. What are the remedies possible? And to do this, we'll have the benefit of having moderator here, who is somewhere here, Erik von Pistolkors, who is head of the economic areas in the European Commission in Sweden, and also other areas as well. So I'm now giving the floor to our moderator, and Erik von Pistolkors is such a brilliant person. So
thank you, Mats. You won't get anywhere with flattery, but don't stop. Anyway, right. Okay. Right, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be taking you through the procedures this afternoon. Our two speakers have framed the issue perfectly, very eloquently, and we have 2 hours at our disposal. It's basically going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be 3 presentations on the issues at hand. Then we'll have a short break, and then we'll continue with the panel, number of questions. So there we are. I think that without no further ado, I will ask Åsa to come up and deliver her presentation, followed by Katarzyna, and then our colleague Mugur from DG Just in Brussels. So that's it from me for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Right, so let's see if we can make this work. Do I need to do something? Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. Right, so I'm a philosopher. So the concept of post-truth is not terribly coherent, I think. Truth is going nowhere. But, of course, there is something that's happening, and it has to do with our relationship to truth and the relationship to knowledge and the spread of knowledge through our communities. That is affecting democracy in a very bad way, and I'll talk about that. Now, this is coming and going, is it, or is it just me? Sound is good? It's okay? Okay, good. So we're sort of a couple of decades into the new digital information environment now, right? And when it first came on the stage, there was a lot of optimism. It was thought that it would be a renewal for democracy. There was a lot of talk about that. And that wasn't a crazy idea, right? Because suddenly, of course, first of all, knowledge was widely available to everyone across the globe. You didn't need to have expensive dictionaries and stuff. You could make yourself heard. You didn't need to be a famous journalist or on TV. You could make yourself heard. Also, social media was used for mobilization during the Arabic Spring and so on. So everybody thought, hey, this is going to be great. We should perhaps have been a bit wiser, because every time throughout human history, when we get new information technology, communication technology, like the printing press, things are not so great in the beginning. Right, so we got the religious wars and burning of witches and stuff after the printing press. And this is what happened, in fact, to democracy during those 2 decades or so. We know now that 20 years ago, a majority of the people in the world were living in democracies. Now it's down to 28%, and that's the latest report that came about a year ago from the Varieties of Democracy Institute in Gothenburg. and there will be a new report any week now, I think. We'll see what happens there. But of course, the US will be yet another country where democracy is no longer, it's not classified as a liberal democracy anymore by most scholars. And what is happening, of course, is not mostly military coups and sudden overthrowing of systems. It's this process that we've been talking a lot about, the autocratization. So if we look back 20 years ago, we had 26 countries were democratizing. Today, there are 19 countries democratizing. Still, let's remember that not everything is going badly, right? There's some democracies that are getting stronger. But if you look at the numbers of countries autocratizing 20 years ago, it was 12, now it's 45, and that's not counting the US. So, okay, so we have this complete correlation in time between a new digital information environment and the decline of democracy. Now, correlation is not causation, as any philosopher will tell you, but there are lots of reasons to think there is actual causation here. So we know something about what drives the autocratization, and that's also from Videm, but also from other democracy scholars like Levitsky and Ziblatt and so on. We know that it's driven by anti-pluralist or populist politicians. It could be left or right. In Venezuela, it certainly was left-wing populism, but mostly it's now right-wing national populists that are driving the autocratization process. We know it interacts with disinformation, and we know it interacts with toxic or affective polarization. There's no clock. Is there a clock there? Yes, there's a clock there. So I'm going to talk about those things, especially a little bit about disinformation, what it's doing to us, and the topic of polarization, because there's some clarifications that need to be done there. Now, of course, that democracy is getting dismantled from inside by democratically elected politicians may sound very strange. Why would anyone do that? I mean, in the 1930s, we didn't know that much about the benefits of democracy. After the Second World War, we do, right? So why is this happening despite all the knowledge that should be available? But the strength of democracy, which is basically political equality, that we all have the same amount of political power through our voting, in theory, we have equal power in that sense, is also, of course, a vulnerability for democracy because we are vulnerable as individuals. And this is not a new idea. That goes back to Plato. You know that Plato was no great believer in democracy. He worried that the only skill that democratic politicians will develop is the skill of winning elections, not making wise decisions. And he worried very much about ignorant voters who would get seduced by a demagogue who would then introduce tyranny. And Plato has been quoted a lot in the US the last couple of years, as you can imagine. Now, he is, of course, very criticized for this. He was anti-democratic, Plato. In fact, he thought we should have an epistocracy, which is a system where the rule of the knowing people, the people who know, he thought they should be actually, in fact, the philosophers. Not a good idea, I can tell you. But the idea that he has, that voter ignorance can lead to tyranny, that's not wrong. And I think we're seeing it now. That's not wrong at all. For 2,000 years, that was also the main argument against democracy was we can't very well give political power to people because they're ignorant, right? But sometime around the Enlightenment, after the Enlightenment, there was a better idea than Plato's idea of letting the philosophers have all the power. Namely, well, make sure that the public is educated then. Right, so that was the idea. Public education in all sorts of ways. In Sweden, you can see it. We had the folkbildningsrörelse, which was very much part of the growth of democracy in Sweden. So public education is the answer, not having philosophers rule. And that is, of course, getting us to what is new about our situation that we're in now, which is the new information environment. It almost came overnight, this, right? The digital technology came fast, and then things shifted very, very quickly. I have led a big, large research program on knowledge resistance, funded by Riksbankens Jubileumsfond. And in that program, we had a media group who were looking at the new media environment and how to understand it and what effects it has had. And the media, that group was led by Jesper Strömbäck, who's a professor in Gothenburg, media and communication professor. And they have conceptualized this, they call it the high choice information environment. And that's precisely what it is. It is a situation where the choice of information falls on the individual increasingly. And in practice, the number of sources is unlimited. And that's not a choice we're incredibly well equipped to make. What happens is that individual abilities and motivations become much more decisive for what information you consume, as compared to the 20th century information landscape, where individual motivations didn't play that kind of role. This has affected people's trust and people's use of media. It has led to an increased amount of false and misleading information, mostly as a result of the lack of gatekeepers, of course. We have we have a ton of political and other influencers who play an absolutely crazy large role in our democracies now. And then we have the new gatekeepers, the algorithms that curate content for us. And we know from lots and lots of studies, and this is one place where we have definite causation, that it promotes extremist messages in various ways. So that's the new information landscape that we are now in. And then add to that the latest little thing, of course. We don't even know where that's going to take us, AI. This was from the US election last year. And you can see then, I mean, a puppy and a crying child. I mean, better propaganda is hard to find. But you could see there that I was AI manipulated. You can see it on the hands and so on. Now we can't detect it anymore. And it's going to get worse. And we're so unprepared for how we're going to deal with this. Images are very powerful. Now, if one were, so there are lots and lots of, it's clear that the radical change in the information environment correlates with the radical change for democracy, and there are lots of reasons to believe there is also causation here. And if I were to summarize it, I would say at least these three types of damages, just from disinformation. There are other kinds of damages to democracy through the social media or through the new digital landscape. But if you just look at disinformation, first, there's obviously voter influence pushing autocratic leaders into power. And we have a lot of state actors wanting this, of course, in Europe, as we know. Russia is very keen on having more far right-wing autocratic leaders. There's an impoverished public debate, damages to what is called deliberative democracy, the sort of our collective decision-making that democracy is, driving unbridgeable disagreements and toxic polarization. I will say a couple of words about that. And there's manipulation of trust, of course. Undermining trust in reliable sources, undermining trust in democracy as a system. There's conspiracy theories play a very special role when it comes to undermining trust. I know that from the studies we've had in our program on knowledge-resistant science denialism. The number one reason people don't trust science is the conspiracy theories. So that's how that works. A couple of words about polarization, then I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about one particular type of polarization. We talk about polarization a lot, and it's not always made clear what we're talking about. Political scientists are usually very insistent that we have to at least distinguish between ideological polarization and affective polarization, emotional polarization. Ideological polarization is about how far people or parties stand from each other ideologically. Typically, it's been measured by left-right kind of distances. Now there are other ways of measuring it. Now that in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem for democracy. It's good that there are alternatives in a democracy. One state has one party, right? We want alternatives, so that's fine, as long as these extreme poles in the polarization stay within the framework of democracy. What is more harmful to democracy is the second kind of polarization, what is called affective polarization. And that is, again, about how we feel about our political opponents, whether we feel they have legitimate claims on power, if we think they're morally corrupt and don't have the right to be part of our society and so on, then we have a problem. And this has been measured, in the US it's been measured for decades, and it didn't used to be, it started in the 60s, I think. It didn't used to be very strongly polarized emotionally between Republicans and Democrats. Now, all the ways of measuring effective polarization goes through the roof. It's at maximum levels, where the sort of next level really is, civil war. Effective polarization is increasing in most democracies in Europe as well. And in Sweden, no matter what people are saying, that's just true. We have, in our research program, we have looked at, we had a group of political scientists led by Henrik Oskarsson, and they've been looking at that. And there's clear data that that's increasing here too. There's a third kind of polarization that I want to mention here, because we did work on that in the program as well. And it's important to this question of the quality of public debate and deliberative democracy. It's called factual belief polarization. And this is something psychologists and philosophers have been working on. I mean, factual belief polarization is the observation that there is a sharp division in factual beliefs along partisan lines, along political lines. Not division when it comes to policy beliefs, because of course that is going to be part of what it is to be politically disagreeing, but disagreeing about the facts, depending on where you stand politically. And it concerns policy relevant beliefs, like factual beliefs about the climate or vaccines or GMOs, what have you, immigration. Election integrity, whether elections were fair and clean. That's also one of these polarized beliefs, especially in the US. And prima facie, I mean, on the face of it, that's just crazy. Why should it be that way, right? Why should which facts I accept depend on how I vote? So there's a lot of research now trying to sort out what the causes of this are. And one hypothesis is precisely that it is a kind of knowledge resistance, where you accept those factual beliefs that belong with your group, your cultural political group. This is called politically motivated reasoning. So that if your group believes something about the climate or whatever, and the researchers come and say you're wrong, you will respond by trying to resist that evidence. That's knowledge resistance. And there are psychological mechanisms that are well studied here that is going on. Because it's very hard for you to disagree with your peers. If your gang believes this about vaccines, you can't go, hey, everybody, they've told us we're wrong. The climate is changing. That's not going to work, because you'll be excluded. So that's one hypothesis. The other one is that it's a result of polarized trust in a very fractured media landscape. So if people have completely different sources of information, they will also believe factually have different beliefs, right? It's really hard, and that's been something we've even done experiments on. It's really hard to know which is which. When are people being knowledge resistant, irrational, and when are people just being disinformed? It's an important difference, because the diagnosis matters to the cure, but it can be very hard in a particular case to say which is which, and that's one important result from our program. Here, I'll just give you this is from the US, but we have similar situation in many European countries, whether you believe that the climate change is due to pollution from human activities or not. That's a factual belief. You can see there 20 years ago, we always start early 2000s when things start to go haywire, right? Republicans and Democrats pretty much agree that that's happening. And then something happens. And now you have 88%. I mean, now we know so much more than we did 20 years ago about the causes of the climate change, right? But now, and the Democrats seem to have been responding rationally to that. You have 88% believing in this claim, whereas the Republicans have gone down to 29%. And we have similar development. We have looked at the Netherlands. We have quite a lot of data from there. And we have looked at Sweden. We have similar development, but not quite as extreme. What's tricky about this then is that it also corresponds with this, which is a polarized trust in the scientific community, right? So who knows what's really causing the factual belief polarization here? It could be knowledge resistance, and it could be polarized trust, or both. This polarization in trust we also see in European countries. This is Sweden. the colors are reversed here. It's always so confusing about the US. Here the left is red and the right is blue. In the US it's the other way around, which is very confusing. But you can see we have polarized trust in universities and higher education here too. Right. It's very, very harmful. And what happens when you have factual belief polarization? Look, democracy is about disagreement in a peaceful way. We disagree on things, and we have to discuss, and we have to vote, and then we live with the result. That's the idea. But if we can't, and a lot of that disagreement is about values, about the conception of the good society. But if we can't even disagree on the facts, then we're kind of lost, because that's supposed to be the ground on which we can stand and have value disagreements. That's why factual belief disagreement is so harmful to democracy. Okay, I'm going to end. I don't have no idea how long I've talked, but hopefully kind of around. I'm going to end by saying a couple of words about free speech, because it's not. So the question is, there's a dilemma for democracy here, right? Democracy is supposed to have all these freedoms and rights. What does democracy do when those freedoms and rights are used to dismantle democracy, undermine democracy? That's the old dilemma. And the freedom that's discussed mostly now is the freedom of speech. And that is precisely because what has changed is the information environment. So the most classical, most commonly used argument for having strong freedom of speech comes from John Stuart Mill, at least. And that's the idea that is needed for knowledge to win, to make it through. Truth will conquer if we dogmatic beliefs will go under and so on, if we have freedom of speech. Now that knowledge argument is not a bad argument, it's true. When we can, debate and question things, then it's more likely that truth will conquer. It works in a seminar room most of the time. Doesn't necessarily work in the public square, and doesn't at all work in the new information environment. That, I think, is quite clear. Now freedom of speech is used to counteract knowledge and dismantle democracy. So we have that dilemma that I was talking about. Now, if you're pessimistic, you take the line of Karl Popper, another famous philosopher who spoke about after the Second World War, he fled Germany to Austria and then to the US. He spoke about the paradox of tolerance, which is, it's really only in a footnote, but it's become a very important idea that he had. That he said that the tolerant society cannot allow unchecked expression of intolerance. It must prevent an exploitation of the open society to destroy tolerance itself. One can understand why Popper thought that. He had seen the horrors of the Second World War. He was Jewish too. But I'm not completely sure it's the way to go. And I think one thing that people are talking about a lot, there's a piece of propaganda going around now that every way of improving the information environment is an infringement on the freedom of speech. Even fact-checking is supposed to be infringement of freedom of speech, which is ridiculous. It's perfectly possible to improve the information environment without having further limitations on freedom of speech. We already have some, every country has. And we have examples in the EU. I hope we'll hear about that now from the Democracy Shield from Digital Services Act, which is legislation that's supposed to require greater transparency and improve the information environment, greater transparency from the platforms, but doesn't limit freedom of speech. It's really important, but everybody says it does. Whenever I mention DSA, they're like, oh, but that limits freedom of speech. Well, it doesn't. The other thing is there is some excellent research. Now, I don't know, you know about IPCC, of course, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. There is an International Panel of Information Environment. I think it's in Switzerland actually now, where they do all these meta-studies on information research. And in one report they have a meta-study on what experts say about how to improve the information environment. And here in blue you see the things that the researchers strongly approve of. And on top comes support free and independent media. I think that's exactly right. We need more of that. And then, media and literacy campaigns and so on. Moderating content is not something most people experts recommend. So there's lots of knowledge there. There's lots of stuff we can do without limiting freedom of speech. But of course, there's a reason right-wing nationalists in conjunct with the big tech owners claim it's an infringement of freedom of speech because they don't want greater responsibility, right? Finally, final thought, which is, we talk about freedom of speech, let's talk about the freedom of opinion a bit more. It's often defined this way, the right to hold opinions without interference. Could there be a right to a healthy information environment? Why not? Let's talk about that more. And Hannah Arendt put it nicely in her book on politics and lying, that freedom of opinion is a farce unless factual information is guaranteed and the facts themselves are not in dispute. Hear, hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Åsa. Thank you very much for that. You put a lot of stuff out there. I must say I did feel slightly despondent about the direction of things are taking. Let's hope that we can, during the course of the afternoon, find some more positive notes on this. Obviously, there is a big toolbox. We will hear soon about the EU, but before that, I'd like to invite Katarzyna Gardapade from the IDEA, International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance, if I'm not mistaken. You are standing in for the Director General, who is unfortunately not able to join us this afternoon. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These are big shoes to fill, I have to say. But I will just start with a personal reflection. As you were talking, I remember I am a psychologist by education. And I remember when we had a course when we were taught that human brain first makes an emotional decision and then a rational part of the brain kicks in to justify this decision and find rationale for this. And this was in the context of electoral choices that people make. The interesting thing about this is this was almost 40 years ago. And it wasn't a new study even then. So I think a lot of things that we are now discovering because of the information environment and its dramatic changes is actually knowledge we had, but we didn't have to use. Maybe I will, being a representative of International IDEA, talk a little bit about International IDEA, but just for the context of why I am going to talk about institutions. I would say it's a credit to Sweden that there is a smallest island in Stockholm that hosts the only intergovernmental organization in the world that is solely dedicated to promoting democracy. And that's the International IDEA, located not far away from here on its own small island, for which we are eternally grateful. We call it Island of Democracy, so you're all welcome to join on the Island of Democracy. And we have been proudly hosted by Sweden for more than 30 years now. We have grown from 14 to 35 member states, and we have been created in this moment in history when everybody believed that the history has ended, as Professor Fukuyama has nicely put it, and we will now live in liberal democracy ever after. And I know very well how important that moment was because I grew up in communist Poland. So I remember. But I also remember that it was important that countries, Nordic countries like Sweden, were a part of the change that we have benefited from. And I will say even today, having worked for many, many years across the world, I say that when Sweden speaks about democracy, this voice matters and it's heard. And I think that is a big capital on which to build, because it's the democracy of values and principles, I would say. And today we are not, I'm saying often that we have lost an ability to debate policies and we are debating positions instead, as very well explained here. And we are debating the foundations of the shared truth. And I would just restate maybe the obvious, which was already said, that democracy is not about people not disagreeing. We should be disagreeing, We may have a different opinion about migration policy. We can disagree about climate. We can disagree about taxes. We can disagree about multiple things. But we must at least agree on the data that informs our opinion. And if that is not the case, then we are not discussing which policy is better, but we are discussing whether the system itself is legitimate and the people representing the system are credible. And that is a very different debate, and it's not a democratic debate any longer. And so when legitimacy becomes contested and the political process, every political process then risks becoming a contest of whether the rules, the referees of the rules, and the results can be trusted. We have our flagship initiative, which is called the Global State of Democracy Initiative. Part of the data that informs the global state of democracy comes from VDEM in the Gothenburg Institute. And we see year in, year out, this deterioration of democracy. And last year, we saw that more than 1/2 of all countries assessed, more than 54%, have experienced declines in at least one of key democratic dimensions. And the key democratic dimensions are representation, rule of law, participation, and rights. And it was the 9th consecutive year in which more countries declined than improved in overall democratic performance. And this was the longest such decline since 1975, when this measurement has been consistently done. And that even happens in Europe. But what I want to bring to this discussion today is two particularly big declines, which is freedom of the press and freedom of expression. Freedom of the press has deteriorated in 43 countries worldwide, and 1/3 of this is Europe. And that is the largest global decline in this indicator since 1975, last year. And that matters because media integrity and freedom of expression are what I would call the infrastructure of shared reality. And if that infrastructure falls apart, then the fact producing bodies, when they lose credibility, when the information environment is actually becoming very difficult to navigate. And we also see from our data that such deterioration often precedes the deeper institutional erosion. Our colleague used to say that we need to fix the roof when the sun is shining. And I think this is an example of this. When we see deterioration in the information architecture, that often happens before elections are manipulated, before constitutions are changed, before courts are captured. And so epistemic weakening can be often an early warning sign of democratic decline. Maybe I would share a little bit of a personal reflection. We talk a lot these days, including in Sweden, about whole of society approaches, total defense, and underneath that there is the concept of trust, and the concept of trust is fundamental to the social contract. The social contract is effectively we agree to certain restrictions, we agree to pay taxes, we agree to laws, we agree to regulations in exchange for the state and state institutions providing in a transparent and fair way certain things that we agreed that we would have from that state. Now, if we don't trust the institutions, if we don't trust the processes, then this social contract basis is becoming very fragile. And if it's becoming very fragile, then our agreement that we are going to live in a certain parameters also weakens. Why would we live in certain parameters? Why would we pay taxes if we don't believe that the taxes are used for the social benefit and for the benefit of our community, our family, our country, for example? But I will also say that this is, I hear the argument about ignorant public. and the what was this? The mass human is the concept that is sometimes quoted here. But I think that the whole concept of manipulation and manipulating information would not be so easily applicable and so easily absorbed if there weren't underlying structural difference the problems in our democracies. If people didn't perceive inequality before the law, if political elites didn't appear insulated from consequences like in Epstein files, if economic insecurity did not deepen, then it would be much more difficult for foreign manipulation to exploit the rifts, because the rifts would be smaller, which is why some of my colleagues claim that we need to focus on institutions and strengthening institutional integrity and democracy that delivers outcomes for the people if we want to address the issue of post-truth. I am very much looking forward to the presentation of the European Democracy Shield. I think it's a very bold, very ambitious initiative to respond to foreign information manipulation, to electoral interference and hybrid threats that are targeting European democracies. And I think that framing is very important. What I also think, however, is that the shield will only be effective if it operationalizes three things. The first one is whether institutions can detect and address foreign information manipulation and interference, which we now all know as FIMI, a term that I think nobody even thought about 10 years ago, and certainly it wasn't commonly understood. We know that hybrid interference is transnational, that it moves across borders, it moves across platforms, it moves across jurisdictions, and it exploits both linguistic communities, diaspora networks, and digital infrastructures, and none of this stops at national borders. Which means that detection and addressing FIMI cannot be purely national response. It just cannot, because it won't work. It requires cross-border monitoring, shared analytical capacity, and rapid information exchange. And it requires recognition of patterns. And this is where evidence matters, and this is where we at International IDEA examine how coordinated influence operations target democratic processes, especially elections, and how those operations interact with domestic political vulnerabilities that preceded the foreign interference. We also develop analytical frameworks that allow mapping FIMI tactics and narratives. We do risk assessments. We support authorities in identifying their systemic vulnerabilities, and we do a lot of things to allow prevention, because we believe that early warning and prevention are half of success. What we also would like to see, and that's the continuum of resilience, is institutions able to respond, because they will have to, at the end of the day, respond at the institutional level. And that's where we believe that Democracy Shield and its capacity building component is really important. But we also believe that scenario planning and simulation exercises, and we see this in some of our countries, in the Nordics, but also in the Baltic states, are very, very important. The second thing that I think Democracy Shield needs to operationalize is protecting elections. Some of my colleagues discuss the protection of elections as a critical national infrastructure. I personally am a little bit afraid, because I know that when you have critical national infrastructure, you tend to set aside rights and democratic values, because you need to protect the infrastructure. But there is something in it. If we protect electricity grids, if we protect nuclear plants, and if we protect airports and ports, because this is our national critical infrastructure, then elections should be treated with the same seriousness. Because if they aren't, if we allow electoral processes to deteriorate, lose credibility, lose legitimacy, then we allow 6th January attacks on Capitol happen. And that deterioration is actually progressive from there. It's much more difficult to rebuild electoral integrity than to dismantle it. And that's where it is really very important that we strengthen the independence and professionalism of electoral management bodies, that we ensure that our political financing is transparent and is actually accountable, that we stress test electoral systems against AI-generated disinformation, deepfakes, cyber threats, and that we prepare crisis communication protocols. Because at the end of the day, electoral integrity is about institutional resilience. We at the International IDEA have what we call the integrated framework for protecting elections. Interestingly, when it was conceived, I think 6 years ago, the very concept of that we need to protect elections against disinformation and foreign manipulation was not yet that well understood in Europe. But now this program resonates in Europe primarily, and this is where this is just 6 years that we have gone a very long way. And the last thing that I think Democracy Shield needs to operationalize is what we call institutional resilience. Institutional resilience tends to be understood as the ability to bounce back. But if that is how we understand institutional resilience, then we base it on two, in my view, false premises. The first premise is that the starting point was optimal. But if the starting point was optimal, then why did we enter into a crisis? And the second is that crisis falls on you kind of unexpectedly, like a striking lightning, and you cannot do anything about it. Which is why we look at democratic resilience as a continuum from anticipation, preparedness, through the going through the crisis without compromising democratic norms and values, to adapting or transforming depending on the situation. And I think this is important because if courts are perceived as politicized, if oversight bodies lack independence, if constitutional safeguards are fragile, then external manipulation will amplify existing doubts and will make the whole system wobbly. And in a post-truth environment, as we call it here, doubt spreads much faster and much wider than correction. And for that matter, there are studies that show that correcting incorrect information amplifies incorrect information rather than giving it a true face. And we do think that institutional resilience is a necessity and a backbone of information resilience. So, maybe one last thing I will say. We have been discussing with many colleagues that Sweden goes to vote this year. It's in the fall, and so it's still fixing the roof when the sun is shining. And I would say the issue of protecting elections, institutional integrity and institutional resilience are best to address now before something possibly and hopefully not goes wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarzyna. Doubt spreads fast and wide. I mean, again, sorry to say, but it's a bit despondent, but it's an issue. We need to look at it. You did partly almost my job for me by giving a few pointers to my colleague in Brussels, Mugo, who's going to, is he with us now? Present the Democracy Shield, sorry. So please, with mindful of time as well. I think we need to press on with that straight away. Mugo, please. You've heard a little
Yes.
bit. Most welcome. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. I hope that you can see and hear me clearly. And allow me to first start by thanking for the invitation to do the presentations done by the previous speakers, which were very informative. And also they at a certain point, I think, will induce a bit of repetition, but it is not a bad thing, because actually we are speaking about the same concepts, about the same challenges, about the same threats, and about the same reactions that we are supposed to have in what we call generally defending democracy. So allow me to start first when it comes to the Democracy Shield by reminding that it was a communication presented by the European Commission on the 12th of November last year. And it was presented as part of a package, which was called the Democracy Package, alongside the first ever civil society strategy. And I think that this is important to at least generally mention, because I think that the civil society does have a key role when it comes to promoting and protecting democracy. Now, where and how did we start with the Democracy Shield? Basically, we are talking about the challenges and pressures, which were already mentioned by the previous speakers. On one side, we have the internal ones, which were also referred, like aggressive tactics, rising extremism and polarization, authoritarian politics. On a second place, but I mean, not on a second place. On the other hand, we have the external ones, the external challenges, which relate to coordinated manipulative disinformation campaigns and FIMI. Very often part of hybrid attacks. And thirdly, we are aware of the challenges posed by the digitalization when it comes to especially artificial intelligence, the use of algorithms, and how they can be used to propagate disinformation in societies. Very shortly, the Shield was put forward after extensive consultations, public consultations, but also consultations with the member states, their authorities, focus groups, civil society, and the European Parliament. Then, if you would allow me, I would touch upon the principles that sit at the core of the Democracy Shield. And they were also mentioned previously today. And the first one is the whole of society and whole of government approach, which basically starts from the assumption that democracy is not an individual or exclusive responsibility or competence of a certain institution, authority, or person. It is basically a collective responsibility. Another principle is the respect for the member states' competencies. From the EU side, as you are all aware of, we do have to pay attention to competencies which are stated in the treaties. And another, let's say, guiding principle or guiding light of the Shield is the respect for fundamental rights. Because if you, I would simply point to the presentation of Professor Dirkvoss previously, and on the dilemma that she was mentioning. Another thing that it is very important to be aware of is that the shield, the democracy shield, doesn't start from zero. It actually builds on an already existing robust legal and policy framework, which was previously adopted and put into application. I mean, I'm referring here to the previous communications from the Commission on the European Democracy Action Plan or the defense of democracy, but also legal framework like the Digital Services Act, the Political Advertising Regulation, the anti-SLAPP package, which is also very important, just to mention a few. Now, when it comes to the shield, it has three priority areas with measures to be rolled out by 2027. So the first one is the integrity of the information space, which is very much related to FIMI and disinformation. The second one is the strengthening of democratic institutions, where we have, I would say, two sub-pillars. One, the free and fair elections, and the second one, the free and independent media. And then the third pillar, it is boosting the societal resilience and citizens' engagement. Now, how we have to look at these three pillars from the point of view of tackling disinformation and foreign manipulation. So there are two main vectors to deal with. So on one hand, and I think it was again mentioned by previous speakers, is the institutional side, where basically we have to reinforce our capacities at the level of institutions, authorities, and to reinforce the cooperation between them. And on the other hand, it is what I would call the non-institutional side, where we concentrate on free and independent media and on informed and educated citizens. And these two vectors basically are interlinked because and actually the overall success of the democracy shield depends on the success of each vector. Just to mention, I mean, it is not sufficient, for instance, to have good and efficient institutional capacity to detect and combat foreign manipulation and disinformation if there is no free and independent media, and if there is no clearly regulated online platforms to ensure trustful communication with the general public. As well, it is not sufficient to have free and independent media if the beneficiaries of the media services are not educated in citizenship and they do not have media and digital literacy skills. So what I've been trying to say with the presentation of these vectors and the approach is that basically the shield tries to have a holistic approach on the pillars that it contains. Now, apart from those pillars, on which I will go briefly a bit later, there is a key action which is provided for in the democracy shield, and it is the European Center for Democratic Resilience, which was firstly mentioned in the State of the Union speech by President von der Leyen, and then in the Democracy Shield itself. So this center is meant to bring together expertise and capacities across the participating member states, the EU institutions, bodies, and agencies, and the EU candidate countries and potential candidate countries. And here I would open a bracket and simply say that, for instance, many attacks on democracy in the EU take place in its neighborhood. and sometimes the neighborhood is also, let's say, an originating zone of attacks. This center, as I said, is actually a framework to strengthen coordination and information sharing between the participating member states and the EU institutions primarily. Because we start from the assumption, and we know already, that there are different experiences at different levels in member states. And the idea is to level up, basically, for everybody. The center was kicked off quite recently on the 24th of February. And when I say kicked off, it means that it is basically the first phase. It will be progressively rolled out. It is based on input from member states. It is project-based. And it will relate to, at least at the beginning, to issues of phishing and disinformation. It will link together existing networks and structures in order to step up our responses when it comes to resilience building and capacity to identify and to respond to these kind of threats that I was mentioning. Now, also importantly, at a later stage, a stakeholder platform will be established in order to enable a contribution from the independent non-institutional stakeholders and communities, such as civil society organizations, think tanks, researchers and academia, fact-checkers, and media representatives. If I am allowed, I would also like to touch upon the three pillars that I mentioned about from the democracy shield. So the first pillar, as I said, is safeguarding the integrity of the information space. I'm repeating myself. It concerns the phishing and the disinformation. The key measures that are foreseen is the preparation of a Digital Services Act Incidents and Crisis Protocol, together with which will be prepared together with the European Board for Digital Services to prevent and address major incidents and interference in the information environment. The Commission will also work with the signatories of the DSA Code on conduct on disinformation to strengthen the efforts on issues such as the demonetization of disinformation, because unfortunately, as you are aware, disinformation is monetized, and there are people that are let's say, making money out of it. And the Commission will also explore the voluntary user verification tools to help users to verify if they interact with real human beings online. We are also starting work to prepare a so-called blueprint for countering phishing and disinformation. And for instance, this is a deliverable which is to be prepared in the framework of the European Center for Democratic Resilience. Other key measures are the setup of a European network of fact-checkers, which will be based on highest ethical and professional standards in order to boost fact-checking capacity in all EU official languages. The idea is to create an independent repository for fact-checking to consolidate the fact checks and facilitate access to them, and also a protection scheme for the fact checkers against threats and harassment. On this side of the first pillar, on the phishing and disinformation, there is also dimension of the EU external action. The idea being that the EU global presence will be stepped up through the EU delegations, through the CSDP missions and member states diplomatic missions. And international partnership will also be sought for collecting responses against FIMI, including through the security and defense partnerships. As I already mentioned, there is a component of involving candidate and potential candidate countries. Now, on the second pillar, we have on one hand the free and fair election side, and on the other hand the free and independent media. And I would concentrate mostly on for reasons of timing, on free and fair elections. As you know, the conduct and organization of elections are the competence and responsibility of the member states in accordance with their constitutional and legislative rules, while also respecting the international commitments and EU law. Under the shield, we intend to step up the assistance to the member states in the framework of the European Cooperation Network on Elections, in a reinforced framework of this network, which will involve actually more systematic exchanges to support the joint development of common tools and products in areas of common interest. And just to briefly refer that, for instance, on 24-25 February, this network held a strategic seminar that dealt with these possible common tools and products. And
Mugo, sorry to interrupt you. I'm going to have to ask you to start wrapping up soon because we don't have much time left and we have a panel, etc.
Will do. I'll just, then if you will allow me, I'll just wrap up with the elections, and I will mention the three tools that we have on our radar, which is basically supporting common work with member states on transparency and integrity of funding in politics. The second one is safety in politics, which is also very important. And the third one is the use of artificial intelligence in electoral area. And I think that these, for instance, would be relevant for in the context of the upcoming Swedish elections. I'm not saying that this would be a silver bullet, because there is already policy instruments at the level of the EU. And to our knowledge, anyway, the electoral system in Sweden is really quite solid. And then briefly, freedom of media, you know, it is very important. I won't be developing on that. The idea is to support them economically and not only. Also, we are talking about the protection and safety of journalists. And then on the third pillar, we are talking about the societal resilience and citizens engagement. Brief words on this: media literacy, education, and digital literacy. These are what it used to be previously, what we called alphabetization. So they are like writing and reading, and there are a lot of measures under this.
Thank you, Mugo. Sorry to
I will stop here.
A lot of information to take in, absolutely. Collaboration among the EU member states on this issue is central. Okay, listen everybody, I think we don't have much time. We're going to have a quick break, and when I say quick break, I do mean it's 5 minutes, and then we'll come back here and listen to the panel. Because we have an eminent panel who'll try and make sense of all the things that we've heard so far. So thanks for that. Thank you, Mugo. I think if those who are interested, we'll be able to provide some sort of information about the Democracy Shield in written format to those who've signed up for today. But we'll take a break and we'll be back here in 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to take our seats for the next part. Please bring your coffee with you. What? Okay, so we are waiting for one member of the panel to. We're four, all right? Okay. Vad händer med min penna förresten? Där är den. All right, everybody, please take your seats. We're going to continue here. As I said before the break, now we have a panel to help us make sense of all the things we've just heard. And let me introduce them. Are you ready for this? 1 second. Okay. Okay. Well, I think there's some response, absolutely. Well, he's not deteriorating into a cocktail party quite yet, but all right. Okay, everybody. So we got about 40 minutes to go. The plan is basically to go through with a few questions, reactions on what we've heard before. Hopefully, if there's time, there will be an opportunity for some questions from the public. We will have some microphones on that. All right, so the panel. Åsa Wikfors, professor, we've heard from her earlier. Director General Jan-Olof Lind of the Swedish Agency for the Media. Media strategist Britt Stakston and Professor Ludwig Beckman, all here. Thank you very much for taking time to be with us and on this particular salient and highly relevant issue. Right, so let's first start. I have a general question to you. On disinformation, where do we stand in 2026? Now that we've listened to the speakers, we have an idea what disinformation post-truth means and what's being done to combat the issue. In your opinion, what's the most pressing threat posed by disinformation in 2026? And you can take it in any particular order. Who feels inclined to start?
I could start. For me, it's let me put it like this, it's the general public's ability to cope with this disinformation, to have the right instruments and capabilities to judge whether something is disinformation or not. And I will come back to some examples what we do within the agency for that.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else on this one?
Can I add one thing?
Sure, please.
And it's a bit of a kind of counter perspective on this. I think there is a threat also that discussions about disinformation, just as discussions on fake news a few years ago, becomes politicized, so that it's used rather as by the people that actually are the problem, and that they can turn the tables and actually accuse the institutions and the public authorities and those scholars that are trying to bring up these problems. They are pointing to us being the problem instead. So I think there is a sort of always this risk of politicization of the very concepts that we're trying to use to combat that, which is, of course, makes the problem more difficult to track.
Thank you. How do you get out of turning the tables on each other? Also, have you got an idea?
Well, I mean, there's such a thing as mirror propaganda, it's called. They always do that, right? They try to overturn an election, then they accuse the other side of trying to overturn an election. So that is just part of this. And disinformation is just one example of that, where if you are using disinformation, then the best thing to do is to accuse your opponents of using disinformation. And the other thing that's related to that is also this, I found in so many of these contexts, they put quotation marks around disinformation, like disinformation, as if it wasn't a real thing. So that's another kind of strategy in that neighborhood.
Says Åsa.
Says Åsa. Says Åsa.
All right.
No, but it's true. You see this among Swedish politicians too. Disinformation. We know what's disinformation, what's not.
Okay, thanks. Britt, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I would say that since your question asks what is very urgent right now, and as a media strategist, I meet a lot of people, regular readers, regular citizens that think a lot about this question, and it's absolutely a fact that it's not only that disinformation and manipulation wants you to persuade you, but it's also about being exhausting you, and that's what I meet. I meet people that have decided that the best thing is to look away because they have their choice and their strategy in life is to not believe in anything.
Okay,
So-
nihilists almost, or what?
Yeah, no, but it's really about looking away as a strategy to survive because
Okay.
it's too difficult to understand what is what. And this sounds a lot of pessimistic. I heard a question around the coffee table that was not linked, targeted to me, but I paused and heard somebody say, "Are we going to leave very more worried about the situation or optimistic?" And I must give the cliffhanger that at the end of the day, I'm still very optimistic for
Good.
the situation, because that sounds very depressing what I just said, but that's a fact that we need to acknowledge.
Okay, thank you all. All right then, we'll continue on this information then. And if we agree that the problem today has two aspects, the first being the shift in the perception of truth and falsification at the individual level, and two, organized disinformation campaigns. How are these two interrelated? Can we address one issue without addressing the other? Takers?
I'm not sure. What was the first one? Just our psychology, the fact that we
Okay.
go for this.
Okay.
Or,
Has two aspects. The shift in the perception of truth and falsification at the individual level. That's the first
well,
part. And the second part, organized disinformation campaigns. How are these two interrelated? And
I
can-
mean, look, people haven't shifted. People fundamentally seek knowledge. I believe in that. That's my optimism. People want knowledge, right? People are capable of thinking and reasoning. People are rational, much more rational than the psychologists claim, by the way. That's a philosophy claim. But we are dependent on the quality of the information environment for our thinking capacities. And when that's poisoned, we don't do so well. So it's not like our psychology has changed fundamentally. It's that interaction with organized propaganda campaigns, for example, and with a general kind of unreliable information environment. That's the change. The first bit is the way it always was.
Okay, thanks. Yes, please.
I think there is a risk that it doesn't really help sometimes to reduce disinformation if it's still the case that the electorate and the voters, the partisans, are very heavily, effectively polarized, as there's a concept that you used also there. Because if people are very effectively polarized, they will always support their part in the political debates, no matter what. They will see the other side as a threat. And information that their side is doing wrong, their side is ruining democracy, their leaders are violating freedom of speech, will not be listened to as a reason for not supporting them. They will support their side whatever it takes, because it's an effective identity to be part of that side. So I think we need also to think about what drives this effective polarization in societies at the moment. And disinformation is one part of that. So it's one part, but it's just one part of it. There are other things as well that creates this very identitarian sort of thrust to, identity-driven politics in a way.
Okay, thanks.
Well, if I could add, because I think it's important to distinguish if it's an external disinformation campaign or if it's internal. Internal, I mean, we have far-reaching freedom of speech. It's not illegal to lie unless you are in court. But so I think on the individual level, I think you have to strengthen those who take on those messages from, for example, social media platforms. And we are doing fairly good within the younger generations, even though we know that they take on the news from the social media platforms. They know how to distinguish between different messages that they see. But it's not only about the young generation, it's the older generation that needs to be sort of educated how to distinguish, because they sort of, it's difficult for them to understand the news, because it's an overwhelming amount of news that they will sort of take in. And I think for them to always be critical towards what they see it's over demanding for them. So I fully agree with you, but I think it's important to distinguish whether it's external or internal information.
Sure. Okay, thank you. All right, Britt, you want to comment on this one, or should we carry on? Because I've got a question for you now.
Yeah.
Turning to the media. Well, it's all about disinformation, but the media. What way have social media platforms changed the media landscape? And what's the role of platforms in preventing the spread of disinformation? And how do you feel about the EU's role in regulating these platforms? That's just a compounded question there for you.
I start with the last one first. I am those kind of internet opinion leaders that really make a point of thanking EU for what you have done. And that is still so extremely important. I can't even imagine how things would have looked if not EU as a whole stepped up like it has. It's not perfect, but it's the best way right now, and it's really, really interesting. All the aspects, DSA, DMA, Democracy Shield, and so on. But of course, we have to be realistic in an era where we more and more tend to go to something that is so far away from what we thought that these platforms would do for us for like 30, 40 years ago. So one thing I want everybody to do that is here, that is, if you haven't read it, please go home and read Tim Berners-Lee's memoirs. And he's the web founder, and it's really, the book is called This is for Everyone, the unfinished story of the World Wide Web. We need to remind us that what we are talking about is not the fact that we do believe. If we talk about the internet as the protocols, and then we have the web, where you find a lot of commercial platforms, like shopping malls, and we are discussing only them. But the fact that we want and keep on really seeing a lot of alternatives where information is shareable and it's easy to publish for each one of us. And what has happened is, I also think the big change is that the ones that owns the largest platforms today, they are coming from another place than democracy. And we need to talk about how they use that power. So what we see today is something that is extremely troublesome, how information power, the economic power, and the political power is so intertwined, and that is not good at all. And of course, if you look at the media perspective, it's not only how the whole business of advertisement that now is then invested in social media, and how that has led to that the established media have huge problems still with all the loss of their incomes. So what has happened is that development, that the common idea that was supposed to do that was also started with strengthened democracy has been something that now, due to the fact that we have so many players whose owners have a total other view on democracy. And I will finish with the perspective that the tech nationalism that is now evolving, maybe we need to go that way because of all the security issues we have, quite obvious, starting with the figures Åsa gave us, but also in reality. But it's not a good development of something. We're building shields, in shields that maybe not be solving the problems like we need to right now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm turning to you two now, or staying on media. What is the role of media and journalism in countering disinformation narratives, would you say? And the second part, to what degree should and can traditional media adapt to the new information landscape to catch, again, citation marks, media consumers that would otherwise be drawn to questionable news sources online?
Could I just first add to what Britt said about this? We, as a government agency, we are responsible for monitoring all the acts, whether it's the audiovisual directive, whether it's the democracy shield, what's under that, for example, the political ads that we are responsible for now, which is important ahead of the election. So we have a fundamental role there, which means that what's done within EU is fundamentally important when it comes to how we relate to, for example, the big platforms and the free media and the diversity of that. I think it's important to say that. Do we think alike among the 27 member states? No. And one thing is that sometimes we always say no to suggestions, while France say yes, because they could regulate in another way than we could do. But it tends to be all right at the end. For me, it's sort of the business model for the traditional media these days. They create value when it comes to news and other things in their media concept, but it's taking over by big platforms like, for example, I guess Google and AI, which distributes the news today and have the interaction with the readers and the consumers, which means that if you Google something, you don't have to go to the web page of Dagens Nyheter. You could only Google and you will get an AI answer to that. And you have to relate to that. And I think the business model of the modern free traditional media is so important that it changes a little bit to adapt to those new circumstances. We are here to promote the traditional media with a responsible editor, because that's safeguarding good messages out to the general public. But at the same time, I think they have to adapt to the new circumstances with the new platforms, because that's where people are.
True. Okay, thanks. We'll leave that then for the time being.
No,
please.
Just to the excellent comments of both of you here. I mean, look, the democratic potential is there, right? It could be great, and it may be great in 50 years. When the press came, big in 19th century, it was terrible. It was fake news all over, right? And then the organizations and the institutions developed and became reliable. There was a lot of self-correcting there because that was the way to make money. That is not how it's going to work this time. But we can do it. We can make this into this great democratic platforms. So let's keep that in mind. I think it's an important perspective.
Okay, thanks.
I just wanted to add to the really...
No, this is what it's all about.
Yeah.
Carry on, please.
The urgent need of understanding what is happening in connection to the AI results, where you see small businesses today have lost 70% of their direct traffic to their websites. And then we're talking about small businesses in general. And what does that do to democracy? People will not be able to work with what they are making their living off. And then with journalism, there are reports saying between 40 and 60%, where you lose the traffic because the AI summary, you're fine with that. So of course that is something that is ongoing, that really has changed yet again the fact of that used to be the missing ads that went to marketing investment in social media platforms, and now you have that perspective that you're losing traffic due to how information is displayed. So those kind of changes is not only in the hands of media to develop in addition to, because they are lost if you see how people use search at this point. But it will be changing all the time, but that's the latest news that is really troublesome for established media. But linked to established media and what we are talking about, really talking more about why is independent media important, and really in a Swedish context it's quite easy to, because everything looks the same if you look at it in a digital, how it's presented to you. But if you look behind, if you follow the press ethics or the media ethics, or if it's a pure opinion player, those kind of perspectives we need to be sure that we create a larger awareness of. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay, we'll press on then with democracy again. So Ludwig, can a democracy where people no longer have the same perception of what is true and false actually work?
Yeah, I mean that's something that also I was speaking of earlier today, and you emphasized that the sort of disagreement on values, but not on facts. That disagreements on facts is problematic. I'm not so sure that that's the way to put it. I mean, I think the disagreements, as everyone has said, is a natural precondition for democracy. That's what democracy is about. But the problem is not just the problem is not whether we disagree. The problem is whether these disagreements are reasonable or not. So we can disagree about what democracy is. That's one thing we disagree about within democracies. We emphasize different parts of what democracy should be. And that's not a problem. That's a sort of resource for the political discussion. The problem is when some people expropriate the concept of democracy and turns it into something that isn't really a reasonable conception of democracy anymore. And then they can use that to say that, well, all of our societies are undemocratic and everyone else is undemocratic, and only we have the right conception of democracy. And then they become kind of dangerous for democracy. So because they fail to recognize that we can reasonably disagree. They fail to recognize other claims about what democracy is as reasonable. So I think it's very important for us not to sort of just speak about whether we disagree or not, to speak about where the boundaries of reasonable disagreements are, and to remember that we must always see that, well, some disagreements are just fine. It's reasonable to disagree, even on facts. Yes. But there are also unreasonable disagreements about facts, and unreasonable disagreements about values. And that's the ones we should worry about. And I think the social media and the new sort of fragmented public sphere that we live in today is really sort of driving the destruction of a conception of reasonable disagreement.
Well, and the existence of reasonable disagreement. I mean, of course, there will be all sorts of factual disagreements in a democracy too. There are lots of things we don't know, right? So we have to keep disagreeing and try to figure it out. But what's going on now is that there are things that we do know that even so are disagreed on in unreasonable ways. So the unreasonable factual disagreement is growing, and that is the worry, not the factual disagreement as such. Because the difference between factual disagreement and value disagreement is that when it comes to factual disagreements, there is a way of figuring it out. We just have to keep getting more evidence and doing empirical investigations and all that. It can be answered. Value disagreements it's not like that. We can argue and be more or less reasonable when we argue, but we can't do experiments and collect evidence. So there's a difference, and that's why value disagreements are more entrenched. They are harder to bridge. But factual disagreements we can normally handle, but we can't anymore. That's the difference.
Okay, so how does that affect the fundamental trust of our democratic system then? It can be resilient to these issues, or
can I add what I think is one of the sort of sources of this lack of reasonable disagreements and moves toward unreasonable disagreements and affective polarization. I think it's the politicization of media that is taking place a lot on the social media. People go there to sort of get news and information, but they get it from places that are call themselves news, but actually are just propagating one specific perspective all the time on society. And when you constantly sort of consume just a single perspective, single very strong ideologized perspective on your society, you become very much affective, polarized by that, and you lose trust also in established media and all other kinds of institutions that together build our democracy.
But yeah, that's the point of the politically polarized trust, right? That's where we're heading, and that's why that's so harmful. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So yes, okay, please, Britt.
One aspect, I'm coming to the positive parts, is that what I do think is a large problem is the fact that 90%, I would say, are silent observers. That means that we are totally occupied from what 10% are acting out, and they are acting it out big time, because that's also what gets visible, more seen in the algorithm and with the help of AI as well. So it's sort of common the Pareto principle, or what is called 20% do and 80% follow. And if the latest figure are always around that, and we have to remember that. And if you look at the Swedish political context and what's coming up to the election, that we even look upon what's going on X without addressing how that is used and what kind of political views you get there. And those are it's a platform that's used so very, very little from the broad of the coming voters. So we need to remember again that we're talking about a lot about that on the commercial platforms, and there are so many that are just looking at that and is wondering what is going on here. And it absolutely creates fears and worries, and especially what's around the corner. They can be quite happy on a regular day, but around the corner they know we have a lot of problems.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, that turns me to the individual, and then to Jan-Olof. Your agency has been tasked by the Swedish government to develop a strategy to increase the public's resilience to disinformation through becoming more informed media consumers. Are there effective strategies to make citizens more resilient to disinformation? Counteract what
Well, I
what
would
Britt
say
just talked about?
it's a long-term work.
Yeah.
Media and information literacy is nothing that will happen overnight to strengthen the capability of the population or citizens in the country, but you have to work constantly with it. So we created, on assignment by the government, mediemedveten.se. That is a very simple education web-based tool for you to go in. You will be asked a lot of questions, and I think it's really worthwhile to take that course. It won't take too long, but it will give you more information of what kind of information are you facing on everyday basis. But I would like to emphasize a couple of other things that I would be slightly worried about. That's influencers. What kind of power do they have ahead of an election? Because they will reach out to quite a number of persons with their messages. If they are funded by political parties, they have to report that. But even so, there are a number of strong influencers, and they could get quite a strong political power ahead of an election. The other thing is what we call election compass. We know that, valkompass. There was a survey conducted in the Netherlands, and they found out that those people were doing that compass test, and they always ended up far left or far right, given when they answer the questions. So I would say that not every one of them are bad, but I would be cautious when you go into an election compass to decide which party or political party should I work for. And so from an individual basis, I think there are so many instruments that you have to take care of and understand what do they promote at the end. But this web-based education instrument, which is distributed to the regions, municipalities, libraries, it's so good. So there will be an AI unit in that as well. So I recommend it quite strong to do that. That was my takeaway from giveaway, I would say.
Okay, all right, thanks, panel. Listen, unless there are any more, I have more questions, but I also want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions to you. But are there any things that you feel have been omitted so far, or you want to clarify amongst yourselves now? If not, then I will ask my colleagues to get ready with the mic and then invite the audience to ask some questions. Katarzyna, I see that you are you allowed to ask a question? No, I'm joking. Yeah, and then number two, of course you are. Of course you are. No, of course you are. No, I think this is important. No, we want that to happen. So go ahead, please. We'll take maybe we'll take a couple of questions and then when ask you to reply. I think that's probably the best way to do it. Go ahead, please.
I have one kind of observation and one question. The observation is this: being from Poland, that is obviously feels itself on the front line. I visited my parents, and my parents received something that the government of Poland has distributed in hard copy to every single household, and it's Civic Preparedness Guidebook. It's small, it's very easy, and it has a big section on identifying and dealing with misinformation and disinformation, and it's it's really good, and I was thinking this is actually interesting because my parents wouldn't find this information on the government's website, but they would certainly read it when it's delivered to them. A question that I have is this. We have increasingly a number of countries, including in Europe, that are trying to regulate the use of social media, especially for younger generations, by banning up to a certain age. And we also have research that shows that after the immediate drop in user base, things slowly go back up to the previous level while people figure out their VPNs and all other ways to circumvent the ban. But my question is different. My problem with this, as I hear also here, is that a lot of responsibility is being put on the user. It's the user's responsibility to protect themselves against the tool that is manipulating them. And I find it problematic because I don't think it should be the user's responsibility to protect themselves against being manipulated. I think it should be the responsibility of the tool that allows manipulation to actually not manipulate.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask about that.
I think that question belongs to Brie. But let me just say one thing. Absolutely. The focus on individualistic-based solutions is a distraction. It's like climate change. If you didn't fly and eat meat so much, well, there are these huge polluters that are doing most of this, right? So it's the same thing. If you only critical thinking, well, you can't be critical thinking in a poisoned information environment. It doesn't work.
So should we have one of those guidebooks?
Yes.
Or not? Because
Yes, but people are going to hate it. They're going to, even when we
that
start...
seems like putting the responsibility on the individual user.
Well, you can do that too, but you shouldn't only put it there. You can also provide information to individuals, but you should keep your eye on the platforms, on the system level. But
Give the book, but don't keep your eyes on it.
Okay.
No, don't exactly. Don't put the blame there.
Britt, you want to reply to Christina?
Yeah, and I will try to be short, but I really have to emphasize that it's a dual responsibility. We have the problems we have due to the business models of the platform, absolutely, and that includes design faults and all that. It's the political strategies that have used the fact that in a Swedish context, for example, we are quite happy with the democracy we have. We have a lot of standby citizens. They're quite happy. They go and give their votes, and they hope that things will develop. They see some problems, but they have been very silent during all this development. But then I always emphasize it also has to do with how we act. And at the time where we are now, we are getting to a point where it's time to call out institutions, political parties that really flirt with all the destructive logic. I compare the knowledge of digitization with how kids are not thrown out on the street. They learn how to navigate in that infrastructure, and it's the whole society that helps kids and parents. It's schools, it's at the end of the day you get a driving license, but it's mutual and it's through the whole life. So that's the metaphor I use to compare the digital knowledge with that kind of knowledge. Yeah.
Okay, quick.
It's already dual, I would say. Digital Service Act puts a lot of requirements on the providers. So it's not only the consumers, but when it comes to age verification or whatever, there is a government inquiry working right now on that issue. It's a complicated matter. And you know Australia, which put up a list. It took TikTok, just guessing now, a couple of hours before they created new platforms, which were not on the list. So there are different, it's a very, very difficult matter. But we are working with that right now through a government inquiry.
Okay, thank you. I think we had a question from the gentleman there at the front. Please say who you are as well.
Hello, thank you. I'm Valdemar Ingdahl, and I currently work for the Institute of Future Studies with issues of research communication and democratic resilience. And I have a question about mediemedveten. Would you say that medievetenheten primarily operates within media literacy, or are there strands in Sweden that more explicitly work and test with preventative cognitive approaches?
I would say it's a more general educational tool, but it's for the consumers. You and I should take on that course. It's voluntary, so we are not demanding everybody to take that course. But it's good to make you more conscious what kind of information you consume and what's the difference, for example, between traditional media and Facebook. We know from surveys that people think that Facebook, they have government funding and they have a responsible editor, which we know is false. But then again, to give you the sort of the blend picture of different media providers or information providers.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, no more questions then? Yes? No more? All right. Okay, then we're just about to wrap up. So maybe some yes, please, go on.
So I had a sort of more optimistic take on this, inspired by, again, what I also said about what the sort of printed press 100 years ago was a mess. But then regulations successively and after a while took form, and we had a good public sphere dominated by printed press. But then the radio came, and then there was chaotic again, and then we regulated radio, and then the videos came, and then there was a moral panic about young people watching videos, and then that was solved. So I mean, there is, with every new technology comes this kind of formative moment where we have to rethink about what the importance of this new technology is for democracy, how it affects democracy, and how we can regulate it in a responsible way. It will not be done easily, it will take time. But I think we eventually will do that. And I think we will, in 100 years from now, we will look back at these times and sort of smile and think about them having all these problems at those days. I mean, so I think just as we can smile and think about discussions about videos in the 1980s and something like that. So I just think that we're in the middle of it. And it's a very important step in the process of coming to grips with what the problems are and how to solve them.
We're probably in the beginning of it, even.
Yeah.
It's the Wild West, the days of the Wild West, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was on a positive note. Well, please be positive and come with some suggestions, etc., and then we can sort of end up smiling as we walk out of here.
Yeah.
Would you like to
No,
start?
good start. Go ahead.
On a positive note, I spoke to one of my European colleagues who told me, if I were in your position in Sweden, when it comes to knowledge about the media, I would be happy. And I think that we are pretty strong in Sweden. We are. So that's a positive.
Definitely. Britt, anything?
Yeah, I would like to emphasize the fact that we need to over and over and over explain what democracy is, and we have to acknowledge the fact that democracy is slow by design, and that is not a friction. That's really not a weakness. It's a safety feature, and the fact is that that's being mocked now by those who don't believe in democracy, and we are sort of pushed into all the authoritarian movements. They are really, it's being replaced with speed, spectacle and permanent emergency. And that affects everybody working in no matter what institution, no matter if you're a journalist or wherever you work as part of the Swedish democracy, that's where you're pressured, even on a local library and so on. We need to remember that we have the resilience in, you mentioned the people movements and studieförbund and so on, the whole tradition, and the small language in Sweden helps us to find the common ground together. So that's really important, and never forget to support free journalism and libraries, I would say. That's really important in this work we are doing, all of us, in different roles.
Okay, all right, thank you, people. I think we're going to end there. A big round of applause to our panel. And thank you for coming. We do a lot of these events, so keep looking at our newsletter, etc., etc. Come with ideas, please, for things you want us to bring up here. Thank you. I'm curious about being a standby citizen, I have to say, but anyway.
I would like to.
Yes,
I think we all. I think that we all like to thank first the people working behind the scenes here, which are many. Okay. And secondly, of course, our moderator would also like to thank very much. And then I'd like to thank the audience that has been very active. Even if not everybody has asked questions, I've seen long term of activities from the audience. And then finally, this has proved not the Wild West, but something else. That you can, going out from factual circumstances, to discuss polarization from facts. And you have proven that this is possible. That is also good reason for optimism and for the spring to come. Thank you.